All right, here we go. We got last homework assignment before we break into the next exam. Just as a reminder, we have our exam on Monday. We have our exam preparation this coming Friday. It's going to be a lot of good information to go through, so please make sure you're adequately prepared this coming Friday. Come in having completed the exam and reviewed the study guide in advance. So I don't know if this will be helpful. This is something to consider over time. I probably should have mentioned this at the beginning of the semester, but it's not something I'm acclimated to. I do provide my study guide and information at the start of the semester. And so if you are curious about what it is going to be covered and things that I focus on, these are guides that you can use during the semester as well. And so I found out several of my students in both my classes were actually using the study guides and making notes directly on the study guide as they were going through that. So again, probably something I should have mentioned, but it didn't just come to mind until now. So thanks for the advice, Dr. Barnes. It's about 6 weeks too late. Yeah. So my apologies for that. But hopefully you do find the study guide and the exam review helpful. As for today, let's go ahead and get through this and we'll call it good for today. So question number one, which of the following is not an activity in the conversion process? As for questions like this, what I recommend you do is just walk through each of the answers and make sure that you understand if it's part of the conversion process or not. So authorized production, is that part of conversion process? That is the linchpin process is we can't have a conversion process. There's no production authorization. That's what starts everything. Issuance of raw materials. What by definition is conversion? Conversion is changing raw materials into finished goods. So you don't have raw materials, you don't have finished goods. So you have to be there. Performing the work actually could be probably part of any process. That's just a really, really bad description. Yeah, but performing the actual conversion and then transferring finished goods to customers. This is not really part of the conversion process right here. So when we talk about not activity, D is going to be our answer. It's important to note that you got to read the word terminology that's used here. Do we transfer work in process to finished goods? Yes, that's part of the conversion process. Transferring finished goods to customers, that would be something that we would do as part of the sales process or the revenue process. So even though we see the word term finished goods and we do have a transfer to finished goods as part of the working process, that's not what D says. D says we're transferring finished goods to customers, which is a little bit of a distinction. So make sure you read the wording. For context on the exam itself, I will try not to give you detailed wording that's confusing. I'm a big advocate for very, very clear detail and making sure that the answers are very, very distinct. They are not going to be not necessarily easy answers. Like it's not going to be you're going to be able to identify the question or the answer just by reading the question. You will have to think about them, but I will not try to make the wording confusing simply because I've had examples of confusing wording in the past on exams that I've taken, and I'm not a big fan of those. This one I think is a little bit confusing in wording, so the terminology is really important, but this is probably not an example of a question that I would ask just because of the terminology wording. Which of the following activities results in work in process moving to finished goods inventory? All right, so what is it that we do? So remember in that BPMN diagram, and I'm going to go ahead and bring up the BPMN diagram. This is the one that we talked about. It's a very simple BPMN diagram. This is your application diagram, but you do need to know what events occur as part of each activity. And these are relate to those transactions from the previous slides. So what transactions take place at each activity? Well, the transfer from work in process goods or from work in process to finished goods inventory, that's when we complete production. All right. There's an alignment there. You do need to know the alignment of all these transactions with each of the activities because that's a fundamental part of the diagram. So that's what this question is asking about. That's not the document I wanted to bring up. There we go. All right. So we're going to talk about completed production. So see there. Question number 4. Which of the following is not a purpose of using lanes to describe the conversion process? What are lanes again? What do lanes represent in the BPMN diagram? Departments in the organization. Very good. Departments in the organization. So what is the purpose of distinguishing between departmental activities? Well, let's just go ahead and go through. Or is it going to document the sequence of activities in the process? Now, just a quick question. Do we need departments to document the sequence of activities? Technically, no, we don't need that. We don't need departmental alignment to document sequence. We can actually depict the sequence without departments. Departments provide clarity, but they do not provide sequential ordering. So I think A is our best answer there. Let's go through the rest. Expose potential problems in the handoff between organizational units. That would be a very good explanation of why we would want to use departments, why we'd want to use those lanes. show important decision points and identify responsibility for those decisions. So let's say that you have a bottleneck in your conversion process. Would you want to know what part of the organization that bottleneck occurs? Yeah, so identifying responsibility is really important. Establish internal control activities such as segregation of duties. So we've talked about segregation of duties. What are the three letters again? Spells a name of a vehicle. Yeah, yeah. Car, yeah, custody authorization recording. Remember when we talk about those are responsibilities that should be separated within a process area, occurs within a operational area, not a process area, an operational area. Okay. So if we're talking about a department, there should be a separation of responsibilities in that area, segregation duties in that area. So that would be a good example of identifying departments to establish those control activities for that area. So A is our best answer, and I think that's a valid answer. Question number 5, which of the following is a business rule implementing access control for the conversion process? So simple or vernacular, if we see access control, what one word should you think? Employee, something the employee does. The employee have access. What does the employee have access to? If I said application control, what am I looking for? System. Okay. So if we're talking about employee, we got 2 system items down here, 3 system items down here. It's not likely B, C, or D. Question is, could it be none of the above? Let's look at A. Employee authorizing production cannot modify inventory records. Okay. Does that seem like a business rule that would move into a control activity? Yes. All right. So that A is our best answer of an example of an access control in this regard. So report it out. Question number 6. Consider a UML diagram of the conversion process that uses the REA framework. What does REA stand for again? Resources, events, and agents. Those are the keys to developing those UML diagrams. You have to identify what are your resources, what are your events, your agents. Those are our entities. Entities are depicted by classes, but there's a 4th class that's not included here. What's that called? Conceptual structure, which we're going to talk about here in just a second. All right. Which of the following events begins a typical conversion process? This was a confusing one because remember in a diagram, I said this is what usually triggers everything to start, but it's not depicted as the very first event in the diagram. It was right in the middle of everything. What was that event called? Let's go ahead and take a look at the diagram since there's not an immediate uproar of answer. So it's right in the middle of the diagram, production authorization. Another way of framing that is authorize the production. All right, authorize production. Generally, that's what's going to start our process. Now, just as a reminder, is it possible that we could have other events start the process? Is that a possibility? Yes, that's what these duality means. Is if we have materials issuance or labor operations that are issued, there must be an implicit production authorization. So these can move in either direction, but generally speaking, production authorization is the intuitively sensible one that's going to start an operation because we say we need inventory, let's go ahead and produce inventory. So that's going to be our starting point for all of this. All right. Question number 7, is that where we're at here? Yeah. Review exhibit 9-8. So 9-8. So if you wanted to go in the book and look at 9-8, it's this one. I'm going to go ahead and just pull it up because it's the same diagram as this one right here in our slides. So 9-8 says, which of the following best describes the labor operations event? So this one right here. All right. So what's happening with the labor operations event? What's going on with that? Now, interestingly enough, labor operations event's a little bit different here than in this diagram. There's not an association between finished goods and labor operations. I think there should be in this diagram, but regardless of how we interpret it, what is the goal of labor operations? What are we doing in labor operations? Are we just working for the sake of working? No, in a conversion process, what does labor do? It's a step in conversion, okay? It's actually what's adding our direct labor costs to the finished product. Which answer is going to be associated with that? Add the cost of direct labor to work in process inventory. Now, just as a clarification, I'm probably not going to get this technical on the exam, but just as a clarification, what if I say indirect labor? Okay, what if I say indirect labor? How do we classify indirect labor from a cost accounting perspective, from a managerial accounting perspective for your 221 class? Overhead, it's called overhead. Would that still be part of labor operations? Yes, okay, because overhead's part of that conversion cost as well. So anything that's part of labor or overhead could be classified as labor. Now, note that indirect labor is not the only overhead cost. You can have other costs as well, but anything that's a labor operation will be part of conversion. All right, moving on. Let's move to the next question. Question number 8, same diagram. Which of the following is a correct posting of a foreign key to implement the model in a relational database? This one was a challenging one and it reflects on something that we've already talked about before. So it's basically saying which one it can be used as a foreign key. That's basically how you should read this question. Now, if I ask this question on the exam, which is entirely likely because we've talked about it multiple times, if I ask a question like this on the exam, I will ask you which of the following could be used as a foreign key in a particular diagram. That's how you should read this one. But this one's saying correct posting of foreign key. So let's go ahead and just go through. Labor operations, primary key becomes a foreign key in production authorization. So labor operations, primary key becomes a foreign key in production authorization. So is that a possibility? It's a possibility. Is that a likelihood? I guess I should say. Well, let's see. Production authorization can have 0 labor operations or many labor operations. So what's the problem with that? We use labor operations as a foreign key in production authorization. What if we had many different labor operations? Would that violate any of our rules? Remember our rules for relational database is that one field can only contain a single value. This violates that, okay? So just as a note, if I have production authorization and I risk my labor authorization code, what if I have many labor authorizations? I'm going to have multiple values in here. So production authorization 1, 2, 3, 4 has 15 different labor authorizations. I can't put those all in the same cell. So that's why it can't be a foreign key. All right. Let's go ahead and think about C and D as well. Okay, which is a spoiler as to why B is correct. Primary categories, product categories, primary key becomes a foreign key in employees. Let's take a look. Product categories becomes a primary key in employees. Okay, so employees can manage 0 product categories or can manage multiple product categories. Do we have a similar problem here? I'm seeing very minimal reaction. I see a few people nodding their heads and everybody else is like glazed over. It's like, this is really important. This is likely to be on the exam. This is why I'm asking these questions. Does everybody understand why this is a problem? Why this is a violation of the rule? We cannot use product categories as a foreign key in employees because it's possible that we could have an employee with multiple product categories. Depicting that down here. So subset pirate, sorry. Did I read the wrong one? So product categories, okay, I think I just reordered these incorrectly. So my apologies. So product categories here. Nope, this is product ID. I've got a different ID as well. Let's just go back to the diagram. So product categories, I'm not sure what happened to my spreadsheet. I'm just losing my mind. So employees are managing multiple product categories. So if I wanted to list all of the product categories listed managed by a single employee, I could have multiple product categories, which means that it's not a 1-to-1 relationship or a 0-to-1 relationship. So that's a violation of the foreign key. What about D? Product's primary key becomes a foreign key in product categories. Let's just go ahead and take a look. Products is product categories key. So basically, products become a primary key for product categories. So yeah, again, 0 to many relationship, so we can't actually have an association there. What about the situation with bill of materials? So products become a foreign key in bill of materials. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at that. All right. So products have a foreign key in bill of materials, which means bill of materials can only involve one product and only one product. So how does that represent in a foreign key relationship? If I've got a bill of materials that by the definition of this multiplicity, can only have one foreign key, can only have one foreign key item or one product item, can I use product as a foreign key there? Yes, because by definition, we're only going to have a 1-to-1 relationship. Every single bill of material will have one product listed there. Therefore, when I list it out as the foreign key, I can know that there's only going to be one that's possibility there. Now, is that likely to be the case? Just intuitively speaking, is that likely to be the case? Probably not in the real world. Probably you can have multiple products in a single bill of material. But in this particular case, the 1-to-1 relationship defines that. So that's why we got a bill of materials with a product ID as single relationship, which is why this is highlighted. So B is the answer. Now, note that was a little bit of a confusing question given first of all, given the nature of the diagram itself, because we were dealing with conceptual structures. Also, the wording of the question was a little bit difficult, but I think it's important to reiterate that point. In order for a primary key to be represented a foreign key in another database, it has to have a 0-to-1 or a 1-to-1 multiplicity with that database. Okay, if it doesn't have that relationship, then it cannot be listed as a foreign key. All right, moving on to question number 9. Which of the following best describes the purpose, or describes the purpose of bill of materials class? All right, so what are we talking about with bill of materials? Let's go ahead and take a look at our diagram then. Bill of materials, remember we talked about this idea of type image, and that was just basically the definition of conceptual structure, something that management wants information about. So what does this bill of materials represent? Well, it looks like it's something that's moving from raw materials into finished goods, or from materials to products, depending on your terminology. So if we use that to characterize it, what's our best answer here? Is it going to be recording the invoices as supplier for materials purchased? No, we don't actually look at purchase the process here, so we're not worried about that. Recording the planned raw material contents for each finished good. That actually, by definition, is what the diagram is showing us here. Okay, so B is our answer. Let's just make sure we look at the other ones. Recording the authorization of production. No, that actually is separate from bill of materials. I don't even think there's an association there. Yeah, so there's no association for bill of materials there, so it's separate from that. And describing the labor required for each finished good, that would actually be this multiplicity right here, okay? Which again, should be in this diagram here, but it's not for some reason. I guess maybe because there's product categories management. So B is our answer there. That's a very clear answer. Even if you're a little bit confused about these other ones, B is very, very easily depicted in our diagram there. All right. Discussion question number 3. Think about UML class diagrams for the sales and collection process described in Chapter 7 and the purchase payment process described in Chapter 8. If you are asked to prepare an integrated model that shows these two processes, which you will not be asked to do this on the exam, but you may be asked to do something similar to this, where would these models intersect or integrate? This is definitely a valid question, something that I might ask you on the practice exam or the exam. All right. So let's go ahead and make sure we reiterate those. So do we have any events that are going to overlap between our 3 process areas? Remember, our 3 process areas: sales, purchases, or revenues, purchases, and conversion. Right at the top, we have purchases, because purchases are going to be needed in order for anything else to occur. We have to have materials in order to do production. Then in the middle, that's conversion. That's where we convert raw materials into finished goods. And then revenue is going to sell the finished goods to the customers. So that was the way the diagram looked. Do we have any events that overlap between those 3 process areas? Any events? We've got entities. Do we have any events? The answer for the events is no. Everybody make a note of that, by the way. I'm giving you a big hint right here. For the diagram, for the integrated diagram, we have 0 events that overlap the purchases. All the events are unique to their process areas. Let's go ahead and take a look so we can actually have some context here. Okay. Remember, it's this diagram right here. All of the events that we listed out are unique to their process areas. Do we have any agents that overlap process areas? We have 1 category of agents. What are they? Employees. What process areas do those overlap? All of them, okay? We have employees involved in purchasing, employees involved in conversion, and employees involved in sales. Now, do we have any other agents? Yes, okay. Remember, we have their customers that are involved in the sales process and the vendors that are involved in the purchasing process. We have no other agents in the conversion process, just employees. So employee is the easy one, all 3 areas, all right? The tricky one comes with the resources, all right? So let's go ahead and talk about the resources in the diagram. We have multiple resources that overlap process areas. And it's important to keep that. This is going to make this clearly critical, all right? So our 2 primary process areas are going to be revenues and purchases. Do we have any resources that specifically overlap those 2 process areas? Which resource is it? Cash, because we have to pay out cash to receive our goods. We have to pay out, or we get to receive cash for selling goods. All right, so cash is going to be either received or dispersed, but it's still that resource that we actually exchange for goods. All right. Then we're going to talk about overlaps of the conversion process area. So when we purchase, what is it that we're purchasing for the purpose of conversion? What is that resource called? So yeah, it's called raw materials from the purchasing perspective, or from the conversion perspective. Remember, our purchasing diagram labeled it as products, but that's a little bit of a misnomer, because if we're in conversion, we're converting raw materials to finished goods. So we do need to make sure that in this integrated diagram, we distinguish what type of products. In this particular one, we're talking about raw materials, the raw unrefined product that we're going to turn into a finished good, which kind of spoils what our next answer is. What is it that overlaps conversion and revenue process? Finished goods, our finished goods, okay? So we have multiple resource areas. As it says down here, resources and internal agents are shared between processes. You can read this as saying our resources, all of our resources are going to be shared. So raw materials, cash, products, okay? Those are all items that are in the diagrams. Cash is shared between these two. Raw materials is going to be shared between purchases and conversion. Products is shared, or finished goods is probably what we should determine that as vernacular. Finished goods is shared between conversion and sales. So all the resources are shared, and internal agents, if you were an organization and you're talking about who are my internal agents, what would be another term for that? Who are the internal agents in an organization? The employees, yeah, the employees. Okay, that's what internal agents mean. Okay, people inside the organization. Outside the organization, those are going to be customers and vendors. Okay, so external agents are going to be process specific. So all events and all external agents are process specific. So keeping that in mind, that's going to be very, very helpful for understanding this diagram, which, by the way, may be relevant because we have a question number 6. So put exhibit 9-8 in the context of the overall supply chain that starts with purchase and the payment process and ends with supply, sales, and cash receipts process. How would you expand to describe Sunset's entire supply chain? So exhibit 9-8 is just this diagram here, the one that we just were talking about. I had it already open. I don't know why I just didn't go to that, but exhibit 9-8. So all it's saying is we're going to expand it out. Now, first step first, okay? If we're talking about expanding out the diagram to detail the entire supply chain, we do not need to include conceptual structures, okay? So we can eliminate conceptual structures from that. We're just going to focus on resources, events, and agents. Now, will this be depicted by this diagram here? Does the entire supply chain, relatively speaking, does the entire supply chain get depicted by the integrated diagram? For the most part, yes. If you just went to my slides and you copied and pasted this picture and put this in your homework, you would receive credit for it. That's all I was asking for, okay? All we're trying to depict is what happens in the supply chain. Now, when we say supply chain, has anybody taken or taking Dr. Park's supply chain class? Global supply chain management. What does supply chain even mean? We talked about it at the beginning of the semester. So it's basically saying where does a product initiate from and where does it eventually reach? So where do our products initiate from? Is that going to be from our vendors? Yeah. If we were going to do expanded supply chain, say we could actually look at expanded supply chain. Would Walmart's supply chain just be their vendors? Probably not. Walmart's supply chain would be their vendors, and there's vendors. Okay. So we could go way back. For the most part, though, we're just going to keep it a simple step. We're going to say we want to know what happens with our vendors, our immediate upward supply chain, and then our downward supply chain are going to be the people we sell to, which we call customers. So when I ask easy questions like that, I don't get a response. That's when I know, okay, it's just time for a Wednesday to be over. Yeah. So it's customers. Okay. So the supply chain is going to be identifying who our vendors and our customers are. Now, technically speaking, the book gives a different answer for this particular diagram. It says this was their answer. How is this distinguished? Well, first of all, they do include the conceptual structure in here, which again, if I ask you to replicate anything on a diagram, you will not have to include the conceptual structures in here. But they do simplify this quite a bit, okay? They include purchases and the supplier, but they don't include cash disbursements up here. And they include the order of the customer, but they don't include cash receipts down here. So this is a bit of a simplified diagram. The simple answer is either of these would work for the purpose that we want it for. All I am looking for is consideration of the supply chain. What happens at the beginning, what happens at the end, and that does include external processes by definition of the question. Now, let's distinguish this from what I would likely ask on the exam, because this is going to be very relevant coming up. What did I say about this integrated diagram for the exam? Do you need to understand it? Yes. Do you need to be able to replicate it for the exam? No. So if I were to ask you to the beginning of the process, I would likely be confined to the conceptual structure or the conversion process area here. Okay. What happens? Where do we receive from? Where does it go to? What are the resource events and agents involved in that? Okay. It's really, really important. You're going to hear me say this again on Friday. It's really, really important that you understand what all is contained within each of the UML diagrams. I know there's a lot of materials. This simplifies it somewhat. I know this doesn't seem like it simplifies it, but it does simplify it somewhat because it actually shows you what are the overlapping entities within those process areas. If you can remember those, then creation of the conceptual structure, creation of the UML diagrams. I don't know why I'm so anchored on conceptual structure. That term's just lingering in my head. Creation of the UML diagrams is a much easier process. But as you are preparing for the exam, as we're preparing for our discussion on Friday, please remember the UML diagrams are going to be a core part of the exam. So making sure you can replicate them at the revenue level, the purchasing level, and the conversion level will be paramount. With that, like I said, we're going to do a short class today. We are done. Friday will be a long class because we're going to be going over the exam and the study guide. So please come prepared. I'll see you all then.